September 1944. Northern France lay bruised and burning beneath a gray sky, the air thick with dust, cordite, and the lingering smell of fuel. The Allied armies had broken free from Normandy, but victory was far from certain. What lay ahead was not a triumphant march. It was a race against time, exhaustion, and an enemy that still knew how to kill. To the German high command, the Americans looked reckless, loud, wasteful, dependent on machines and endless supply lines. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt reportedly dismissed the American advance with quiet confidence. He believed the enemy would collapse under the weight of its own momentum. "They will outrun their supply lines," he said, "and then we will destroy them." At first, it seemed he might be right. General George S. Patton's Third Army was moving faster than any modern force had ever moved. Sherman tanks rolled across open farmland, kicking up clouds of dust that could be seen for miles. Infantry rode atop half-tracks, weapons clutched tight, eyes scanning hedgerows for ambush. The pace was relentless, but speed came at a cost. Fuel began to vanish. At a crossroads near Chartres, a column of tanks stood silent, steel giants reduced to immobile statues. One tank commander climbed down, boots crunching on gravel, and stared at the empty fuel gauge. "Hell of a way to stop a war," he muttered. The engines were ready, the men were ready, but the tanks were dry. German reconnaissance planes circled high above, watching the stalled columns with growing interest. Officers on the ground began to believe the moment had come. If the Americans could be delayed just a little longer, the counterattack might succeed. Behind the front lines, panic quietly spread through Allied headquarters. The supply system built for a slow, methodical advance had collapsed under the speed of success. Railroads were destroyed, ports were damaged, trucks were scattered across France, overworked and under-maintained. Then came a decision born of desperation. A vast, improvised supply artery would be created, one that never stopped moving. It was called the Red Ball Express. Thousands of trucks were pulled from every available unit. Drivers, many of them African-American soldiers relegated to support roles, were ordered to move day and night. Roads were marked with red-painted circles nailed to trees and posts, forming a one-way lifeline from the beaches to the front. The rules were simple: keep moving. Don't stop for wrecks. Don't stop for the wounded. Don't stop for anything. Engines roared through the darkness. Headlights were forbidden, only slits of light pierced the black roads. Rain turned dirt routes into rivers of mud. Tires blew out. Engines overheated. Men drove until their hands shook and their eyes burned. German aircraft began to notice. Fighters swooped low, strafing the convoys. Trucks burst into flame. Drivers dove into ditches, then climbed back into smoking vehicles and drove on. One young driver, Private Elijah Turner, later remembered gripping the steering wheel so tightly his hands bled. "We knew if we stopped," he said, "someone up front wasn't getting fuel. And that meant someone wasn't coming home." Night after night, the roads pulsed with motion. Thousands of tons of fuel, ammunition, and food surged forward, mile by mile, keeping the American spearhead alive. From their command posts, German officers watched in disbelief as reports came in. Columns that should have stalled were moving again. Tanks once thought stranded were advancing. The American momentum hadn't broken. It had multiplied. And as the rumble of engines rolled eastward through the darkness, the truth became impossible to ignore. The war was no longer about who had the strongest army. It was about who could keep moving when everyone else was forced to stop. Dawn broke over eastern France with the low thunder of artillery rolling across the horizon. What had begun as a desperate gamble was now transforming into a relentless surge. The fuel was flowing. The trucks were still coming. And with every mile they covered, the balance of the war shifted. Patton's Third Army surged forward again, engines roaring back to life as if awakened from a brief, angry sleep. Columns of Shermans pushed through villages still smoldering from retreating German units. Infantry followed close behind, boots crunching over shattered stone and broken glass. The rhythm of advance returned, fast, brutal, unstoppable. German commanders felt it immediately. Reports flooded headquarters. American units appearing where they were not expected, supply dumps overrun, defensive lines pierced before they could be fully formed. The pace was no longer human. It was mechanical, relentless. One captured officer would later admit, almost in disbelief, "We planned for weeks. They arrived in days." In the skies, P-47 Thunderbolts prowled like predators, diving on retreating columns and rail yards. On the ground, artillery thundered in support of armored spearheads. Every mile gained was paid for in sweat, blood, and fuel burned by the ton. Yet behind the roar of combat, the real struggle continued on the roads. Drivers pushed past exhaustion into something colder and quieter. They drove with eyes half closed, hands numb, nerves stripped raw by the constant threat of air attack. Some never made it back. Their trucks were found burned out along the roadside, names stenciled on the doors, cargo still intact. Others drove through fire and kept going. One convoy commander later said, "You stopped thinking about tomorrow. You just drove for the men ahead of you. Because if you stopped, they stopped." By mid-September, German resistance began to fracture. Units withdrew in disorder. Fuel dumps were abandoned. Orders came too late or not at all. The speed of the Allied advance had broken the rhythm of German command and control. And behind it all, the Red Ball Express kept pounding the roads into dust. When the offensive finally slowed, when the front stabilized and rail lines were restored, the cost became clear. Thousands of drivers were exhausted beyond measure. Many would never be recognized beyond a line in an after-action report. Yet without them, the tanks would have sat silent, the infantry pinned in place, and the war's momentum lost. Long after the guns fell silent, veterans would speak not only of battles and bravery, but of movement. Of roads that never slept. Of engines echoing through the night. The victory in France was not won by firepower alone. It was won by motion. By men who drove through darkness so others could fight in daylight. And by a simple truth proven on the roads of Europe in 1944. Wars are not only fought by those who pull the trigger, but by those who keep the wheels turning. The war did not end with cheers or sudden silence. It slowed, like an engine finally allowed to cool after being driven beyond its limits. By late autumn, the roads that once thundered with convoys grew quieter. Rain washed the dust from the ruts carved by thousands of tires. Wrecked trucks were pushed aside, their twisted frames rusting beside hedgerows, silent witnesses to the speed and strain of the advance. For the men who had driven the Red Ball Express, the war did not feel over. Not yet. Some were reassigned. Others waited in muddy camps, staring at empty roads that still echoed in their minds. Sleep came in fragments. Engines hummed in dreams. The smell of fuel never seemed to fade from their clothes or their hands. Letters home carried fewer details now. What could be said? That they had driven for days without stopping. That friends vanished somewhere between checkpoints. That victory felt less like triumph and more like exhaustion layered on top of grief. As winter crept in, word spread that the Germans were gathering for one last gamble. The Ardennes. The Bulge. Once again, fuel would decide who moved and who froze in place. Once again, trucks would roll through snow and shellfire, headlights dimmed, drivers hunched forward against the cold. But something had changed. The Allies now understood the power of movement, of supply, of relentless pressure. The lessons of the Red Ball Express had rewritten the rules of modern war. When the fighting finally ended in Europe, there were no parades for the truck drivers waiting in muddy lots. No headlines praising the men who slept at the wheel so others could advance. Most returned home quietly, uniforms worn thin, stories locked away. Yet the legacy remained. Every modern army would study what happened on those French roads. How logistics became strategy. How speed became survival. How victory was built not only on courage at the front, but endurance far behind it. And somewhere in the silence after the war, if you listen closely, you can still hear it. The low growl of engines in the dark. The rattle of loose cargo. The steady, unstoppable rhythm of wheels carrying history forward. Years passed. The world rebuilt itself in layers of concrete and memory, and the men who had driven through fire returned to lives that rarely asked what they had carried with them from the war. Some became mechanics, truck drivers, factory workers. Others tried to forget engines altogether. But none of them ever truly left those roads behind. In quiet moments, the memories surfaced without warning. A long stretch of highway at night could feel too familiar. The hum of tires on asphalt would pull them backward in time, to convoys stretching beyond sight, to the dull red glow of taillights disappearing into darkness, to the constant fear that the road ahead might vanish in flame. They remembered the weight of responsibility more than the fear. Not the enemy, not even death, but the knowledge that if they failed, entire divisions would stall. That men at the front, crouched in foxholes or trapped in burning steel, were depending on fuel that had not yet arrived. Decades later, historians would write about sweeping maneuvers and brilliant generals. They would draw arrows across maps and speak of breakthroughs and collapses. But the truth lived in the margins of those stories, In the logbooks smeared with oil, in the names etched on roadside markers, in the quiet determination of men who never fired a shot in anger yet carried the war on their backs. At reunions, the survivors spoke softly. They didn't boast. They shared small moments instead. A tire changed under fire, a cigarette split between two exhausted drivers, a laugh shared at dawn after another night survived. One veteran once said, "We weren't heroes. We were just trying to keep the road alive." And maybe that was the greatest lesson the war left behind. That victory is not always forged in moments of glory. Sometimes it is built mile by mile, truck by truck, man by man. Long after the guns fell silent, long after the world moved on, the echo of those engines still rolled through history, steady, unstoppable, and unseen, carrying with it the quiet truth that wars are not only won by those who fight, but by those who make the fighting possible. Time moved on, as it always does, and the world grew louder with new conflicts, new machines, new wars that seemed faster and more distant than the one fought on Europe's broken roads. Yet the lessons of that long drive across France never faded from the minds of those who had lived it. In military academies, instructors spoke of logistics with reverence now. Not as an afterthought, but as the backbone of every campaign. They studied maps marked with supply routes instead of front lines, learning how momentum could win battles before the first shot was fired. The Red Ball Express became a case study, not of heroics under fire, but of endurance under pressure. And still, the men who had lived it rarely spoke. When they did, it was never about glory. It was about the sound of engines idling in the dark, waiting for the signal to move. About the way dawn looked when you hadn't slept in 3 days. About the moment you realized the road ahead was clear, and for a few precious miles, nothing was trying to kill you. Some of them lived long enough to see their grandchildren ask about the war. They would pause, searching for the right words, then smile faintly. "I just drove a truck," they'd say. But history knows better. Those trucks carried more than fuel and ammunition. They carried momentum. They carried hope. They carried an army across a continent and helped bend the course of a global war. And though the engines have long since gone silent, the road they carved through history remains, an unbroken line connecting sacrifice to victory, and ordinary men to extraordinary impact. Because in the end, the war was not only won by those who fought at the front, it was won by those who refused to let the road end. The years rolled forward, and the world changed in ways those drivers could never have imagined. New wars came and went, fought with satellites and screens, with drones replacing convoys and algorithms replacing maps. Yet beneath all the technology, the old truth endured. Nothing moves without supply, and no victory lasts without those willing to sustain it. In quiet towns across America, old men gathered at VFW halls and small diners, their conversations drifting between ordinary life and fragments of a past only they fully understood. A clatter of silverware might sound too much like loose chains rattling in a truck bed. A long stretch of highway could still make the heart tighten for reasons no one else could see. They never called themselves heroes. Most insisted they were lucky. Lucky to have survived, lucky to have made it home. But sometimes, when the talk turned reflective and the coffee grew cold, one of them would say softly, "We kept the line alive." And the others would nod, because no further explanation was needed. History books would later reduce their effort to charts and logistics tables. Supply tonnage, miles driven, days sustained, necessary facts, but incomplete ones. They could never fully capture the exhaustion that lived in the bones, or the courage it took to climb back into a truck knowing the road ahead might be the last. What those men carried was not just fuel or ammunition. They carried belief, the belief that movement meant hope, that stopping meant defeat, and that even the smallest roll mattered when everything was on the line. And so the story of the Red Ball Express does not end with a battle, or a surrender, or a parade. It ends in motion, in wheels turning through darkness, in engines pushing forward despite the odds. Because long after the guns fell silent, long after the maps were redrawn, the lesson remained. Wars are not won only by those who fight at the front. They are won by those who keep the world moving forward, 1 mile at a time. Time eventually claimed even the strongest memories, softening their edges the way weather smooths stone. But some truths refused to fade. Long after the uniforms were folded away and the medals tucked into drawers, the spirit of that long road endured, not in monuments or speeches, but in the quiet understanding passed from one generation to the next. A father teaching his son how to drive. A mechanic showing patience with a stubborn engine. A convoy of headlights moving through the dark on a modern highway, unknowingly echoing something older. The men of the Red Ball Express had proven that victory was not always loud. Sometimes it arrived on worn tires and empty coffee cups. Sometimes it came in the form of discipline, endurance, and the willingness to keep going when no one was watching. They had learned something few armies ever fully grasped, that war is not only fought with courage, but with consistency. Not just with bold attacks, but with the quiet resolve to show up again and again, no matter the cost. In the end, their greatest legacy was not the distance they traveled or the tonnage they hauled. It was the idea that ordinary people, placed under extraordinary pressure, could become the backbone of history without ever standing in its spotlight. And so the road stretches on, past battlefields reclaimed by grass, past towns rebuilt, past generations who live in peace they never had to earn. Somewhere in that long stretch of time, the echo of engines still hums softly beneath the surface of the world. A reminder that when the moment demanded it, when the future hung on motion itself, there were those who answered not with words, but with wheels turning into the dark. And still, the road never truly ends. Long after the last veterans were laid to rest, long after the maps of Europe were redrawn and redrawn again, the echoes of that great movement remained embedded in the modern world. Every supply chain, every convoy crossing continents, every humanitarian mission rolling into disaster zones carried an invisible inheritance from those wartime roads. What the Red Ball Express proved was not just logistical brilliance, but something quieter and more enduring, that victory is often built by people whose names will never appear in bold print. Men who did not charge machine gun nests or plant flags on conquered ground, but who held the thin line between chaos and collapse through discipline, endurance, and unbreakable routine. Their legacy lived on in doctrine turned to practice, and in practice turned into instinct. Military planners spoke of throughput and sustainment, but beneath the technical language was the same truth learned in 1944, momentum is life. Lose it, and even the strongest army withers. Yet the deepest legacy was human. It lived in the quiet pride of families who knew their fathers and grandfathers had been part of something larger than themselves. In the way a worn photograph might be taken from a drawer, an old truck, a tired smile, a convoy stretching to the horizon, and studied not for glory, but for understanding. Those men had driven into uncertainty so others would not have to. They endured the dark so the future could move forward. And even now, as highways stretch endlessly across continents and engines hum through the night, their story continues, not shouted, not celebrated loudly, but carried forward in motion itself. Because as long as something moves toward hope, as long as wheels turn for something greater than oneself, the spirit of that long, dangerous road lives on.